Welcome to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. Established in 2016, the Fintech Times is a global multimedia news outlet centered around the world's first leading fintech newspaper. We report on the latest and brightest ideas from the fintech world. Follow the conversation using hashtag TFD News and Views and follow us at the Fintech Times.
Hello and welcome back to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps you save time, money and build customer trust, all by centralizing program requirements and evidence collections for frameworks like DORA. If you want to manage risk and prove security, then head to vanta.com/fintech times to learn more. Now, we're back for one last episode in 2024, just in time for Christmas. This week it is just me and you, Francis. How are you? And are you all ready for Christmas?
I am very, very, very prepared for Christmas. It's been a very slow week. I mean, we haven't heard us, or I don't think we've said that at all this year. But it has been slow this week. There's not been much news coming in, which isn't surprising, I'll be honest. I feel like people probably wait until the new year to make their new announcements at their companies. But nonetheless, we have had some interesting news come across our desks. And looking forward to talking fintech with you today.
Completely agree. It's a strange time when everyone's saving announcements, they're saving their findings for the new year when everything kicks back off. Everyone's back to work, back in the office, and we always have to wait probably till the second week of January to really get things going and kick things off properly. But as I said, it's kind of the time just in time for Christmas, and we've trawled high and low for Christmas-related fintech stories to share with you, but frankly, there aren't any. So instead, we're bringing some of the latest fintech news stories as usual. So Francis, what are you bringing to the table today?
So this week, my article has a very optimistic feel to it, and it's for the first time neobanks have overtaken legacy banks in app downloads.
Fantastic. And just to try and keep that Christmas vibe alive, I'm going to bring what is mostly a feel-good story about some banks that have recently introduced initiatives to improve the accessibility of their services. But Francis, I'd like the sound of your story, so why don't you go first?
Yeah, absolutely. So my article this week comes from Split Metrics as it reveals the findings from its research on banking app downloads. Its data reveals that UK neobanks boast an estimated 71.78 million Android users, narrowly surpassing the 71.58 million users of legacy banks. This year has also seen UK neobanks attract approximately 18.6 million new users compared to the 7.5 million added by traditional banks. So among the front runners in the challenger bank category are Revolut with 15.6 million downloads, followed by Monzo, Starling, Virgin Money and First Direct. And conversely, the legacy banks seeing the most growth include Lloyds, Barclays, Halifax, NatWest and HSBC. So we've seen the rise of mobile banking continue to sort of take off in recent years, and it seems like that trajectory is only going to continue to grow. And we've also seen, in light of this, sort of other fintechs, as the article touches on when it analyzes platforms such as money management apps. But that's kind of besides the point here. We're sort of looking specifically at neobanks and traditional banks. But it does go to show that fintech is continuing to grow, and having that sort of financial service in your pocket is seeming to be a bigger and bigger thing, and it's almost expected now. And I don't think it is almost expected, it is expected now. So the main thing I wanted to discuss with you today is, do you think this trend is going to continue to grow, or do you think that it's going to sort of stay at this 50-50 mark now? Because obviously traditional banks have the perks of, going into a bank and speaking to an expert and a sort of a financial advisor or something like that. That is in your bank. Whereas if you're solely with a neobank, everything is done digitally. But we are in a digital age. So what do you think? Do you think we're going to continue to see the rise of digital, or are we going to sort of go back in time and sort of see a rise of legacy banks? What do you think?
I think it's something we talk about a lot, especially as the continued rise of neobanks and how digital first banks, new sort of challenger banks are coming in with their new offerings, and they are becoming more and more popular. And it's interesting to see we're now at that kind of turning point where now, the downloads are more popular. More people are downloading their apps than the traditional banking apps, even if it is practically 50-50 still. They've got only the slightest edge, but I'd expect to see maybe the digital first banks, particularly because the apps are their thing. In order to be with those banks, really you have to have the apps. You're not going to be logging onto your laptop every time just to see your bank balance. And I think that trend will continue. Whether we will see a point where it sits there and stays, or 60-40, 75-25, whatever the ratio may be. But I think one thing we have seen this year as well is just the efforts that I guess traditional banks are putting in. And while we often talk about the sort of legacy tech and how it's harder for them to pivot to offer these new offerings that the challenger banks can so quickly, but with through partnerships with various fintechs, we're seeing these traditional banks quickly offer new offerings and new products to customers. And I think it really means that, I guess, the further in time we go, the more of a level playing field it will be, and it's just a question of how much these challenger banks can capitalize on the advantage that they have right now, because eventually, surely, these banks are going to be caught up, and they are going to be able to offer the same things at the same speed, whether or not that's for a long time. I always found it interesting, to see that Revolut was pretty far ahead in terms of downloads. That was leading the way for the challenger banks. And I wonder if that has anything to do with the fact that Revolut has had quite a lot of publicity this year. Obviously it got its UK banking license, whether that's something that makes people trust it more. So I think that's something to take into account as well. As we always talk about how these traditional banks have a lot of trust, and yet challenger banks, it takes more time for them to build that same level of customer trust and want to put their money in. But UK banking licenses is something that people that even aren't in the fintech industry, become very aware of. It's in the mainstream news. They see it and they think, oh, well, now I'm protected if I put my money in there. So, what's the harm? So, yeah, I think that's a big thing too. But yeah, to answer your original question, I think this trend will continue at least for the next few years.
Yeah, I think that point on the banking license by Revolut is really good, because that sort of almost acts as a domino effect. I think if people see, oh, well, Revolut's a challenger bank. Well, we've also seen Monzo and Starling, they're challenger banks, and if we can trust Revolut, then we can trust them as well. So what you said there makes complete sense. I think another interesting thing, or a different way to look at it, is instead of thinking that legacy banks need to catch up with digital banks and neobanks, I think it'd be interesting. I mean, this is completely hypothetical and kind of defeats I don't want to say gimmick necessarily of a challenger bank, but defeats the purpose of a neo digital only bank. But what if we see sort of Monzo and Starling then create in-person places that people can go to speak to financial experts? Maybe we'll see that, and then that will sort of also change the tide of who has the more consumers. But I think that is probably unlikely. I think the whole point of a neobank, as I sort of just said, is to be digital only. But I think that is an interesting idea, that perhaps that will be what impacts customer loyalty, and like you say, legacy banks will catch up eventually. But yeah, no, I think it's definitely an interesting finding, and then it's, like I said, it's a nice way to sort of end the year saying, look, they're finally even. The sort of the boost of digital that happened as a result of COVID has now sort of, I don't want to say it's hit its peak, but it's sort of showing that it's here to stay. I mean, we already knew that, but the fact that the adoption levels are now in favor of the digital products, I think is a nice way to end the year. But yeah, with that, why don't we go to your article?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said, my story is all about banking accessibility and inclusivity. And we made the article shortly after the UK challenger bank Monzo partnered with SignLive, which is an online interpreting service for British Sign Language, to help improve inclusivity for users who rely on BSL and enable them to communicate with the bank's customer support team for a fully accredited interpreter in real time. And it kind of coincides with other banks that have recently made efforts also to support deaf or hard of hearing customers, such as the Spanish bank CaixaBank, and the Valencia-based bank is now piloting a new program dubbed S Visual, which enables its customers to receive information on financial services through a system of simultaneous video interpreting in sign language delivered by a qualified interpreter. And I thought these were just a really nice sort of stories that really do dramatically help inclusivity for deaf and hard of hearing customers. And there's also another kind of related story from Bunk, which is Europe's AI-powered bank, when it upgraded its AI assistant Finn, introducing real-time speech-to-speech translation within its app. And what that essentially does is, if a customer rings via the app to the bank asking a question, they can speak in their native language, and the AI will offer a translation to the customer service assistant. And then when the customer service assistant speaks back, it offers a translation into native language, which really just eases the whole process. It does it in real time as well, which ensures that people are getting the information that they need quickly. They can talk on the phone. They don't need to wait for someone who speaks their language to become available. And it would be really interesting to me to see, just how effective these types of AI programs are. But you think if a bank like Bunk is rolling it out, it must be pretty seamless because in the banking industry, as we know it, they've got to be very careful about the services they roll out, and they don't want any mistranslations going on that misinform people. So I would be really interested to see that in action. But the reason I really wanted to bring this to the table is just to get your reaction on this, and also ask the question, what more do you think should be done in the banking space to just ensure that accessibility and inclusivity just goes even further, and that everyone can access banking services in the future?
I'm not sure if it's necessarily something that needs to be done so much as it will happen naturally. I think because of the whole point of, by being more inclusive, financial services are opening themselves to having more customers. I think naturally what's going to happen is, as one organization says, for example, we are now offering a service that helps people who use BSL, for example, then the next organization might say, okay, well then we'll now offer a service which is especially helpful for those who have sight visual problems or something like that, visual issues, where they offer something, the next level of braille or something like that. I think the idea is that one organization will say, okay, well, this is how we're going to be more inclusive, and then the next organization, in order to stay competitive and still have a way to have an access to as big a client pool as possible, I think they will naturally sort of say, okay, well, how can we be more inclusive? So I think with time that's going to happen naturally. I don't think organizations necessarily need to, or as a sort of from a consumer standpoint, we don't necessarily need to say to the organizations like, this is what we want. I think it's going to happen. One of the really interesting quotes that I found from the article and stood out to me came from Jazz Shah, a fintech product consultant, who said, Monzo has been quite the pack leader when it comes to digital banking innovation. So my hope is that banks see the Monzo and Bunk examples and look at the incoming EU Accessibility Act and take a proactive approach to creating accessible, inclusive products by embedding inclusive research, strategy, and design processes into the product development processes. In turn, this has been shown to increase profits and revenues versus non-inclusive competitors, whilst more importantly proving extremely valuable to end customers. So this is kind of just adding to that point that I just said, that from a organizational standpoint, by not being inclusive, you're going to be hurting your profit margins, because you're going to be limiting how many people, and this is going to sound bad, but it's the truth of the matter, is how many people you can profit from. But at the end of the day, it's not necessarily you're taking advantage of these people, because you are offering a service which is extremely valuable to them. So ultimately, I think, this is how you're going to build good customer service offerings. And in turn, that reputation will lead to greater loyalty, I think, from sort of customers, and that will only sort of continue. And I think that is the recipe for success from any firm, really.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that point on these banks really ensuring that they do the best they can commercially is a huge point, because I think we've seen that not just banks, but in whatever industry, even if there is a way to do something that makes it more inclusive, it's not likely to happen unless it's going to improve their profits, or they're going to prioritize other things that do first. And I think that proving that these kind of initiatives actually help them attract customers and they are good for profits, it's just another great way to say, listen, inclusivity is just the way to go, because it can make such a difference. And someone that made that point in the article is Joanne Dewar, the lead at Project Nemo, which is the 12-month campaign sharing compelling stories through films and podcasts to educate the UK's fintech industry on disability inclusion. And she said that Monzo and Bunk are basically proven that addressing diverse customer needs is not only achievable but commercially beneficial. And I think that once these sort of firms, widely recognizable firms, do this, people realize, oh, okay, they've actually gained X amount of customers because they've introduced this inclusivity initiative. And like you said, it can have a huge impact. And I think the one way to inspire action is actually showing banks, if you don't do this, it's actually going to hurt you in the pocket. You're going to make less money. You're going to have less customers. Customers are going to leave you to go elsewhere that have more inclusive and more accessible services. And when we talk about blind and deaf people, this isn't something that is just 1% of the population. It's still a huge proportion. Deaf, hard of hearing, huge proportion of the population. And it's certainly an area that it's almost a surprise when you talk about it in this way, to think not a lot has been done in that sense. So it's good to see that these firms have done that and really taken a proactive approach. And hopefully, as you said, that leads to a knock-on effect where we see more and more firms doing the same thing. But I think that ties it up very nicely and brings us to the end of our news segment. Now, as always, if you liked any of the news or insights that we shared today and you want to hear any more, make sure you head on over to the fintechtimes.com, where we're constantly sharing new news and insights over there. And that brings us on to what I learned this week. So every week, so much new news and insights crosses our desks, and we like to pick something out to share with our listeners. So Francis, I'll let you go first. What have you learned this week?
This week I learned that 90% of organizations lack dedicated fraud prevention teams, and as such, accounts payable teams are suffering the most, and that automation can really combat the rise of AI invoice fraud that results from a lack of prevention teams.
And to bring the sort of Christmas episode in the loosest possible term, to a close, I found that Capital on Tap has found that 21% of UK consumers prefer to buy from smaller businesses compared to a larger chain, while only 18% favour larger retailers to buy their Christmas gifts from this year. And that brings us to the end of the podcast. Hopefully all of our listeners do have a wonderful Christmas, and we will see you next year.
Happy holidays and a happy new year to everyone. See you then.
Thanks for listening to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. Don't miss next week's episode and continue the conversation using #TFT News and Views and follow us at the Fintech Times.